Essence here is split into two in such a way that, to begin with, two different ways of considering it are involved. In part, essence must contain difference within itself. In part, just because of this, the two ways of considering it merge into one. For the abstract moments of pure being and the negative, by which they are distinguished, are then united in the object so considered. The universal common to both is the abstraction of a pure inward oscillation, or of pure self-thinking. This simple rotatory motion must become more complex because it is itself only motion by distinguishing its moments. This distinguishing of the moments leaves their unmoved unity behind as the empty husk of pure being, which is no longer actual thought, no longer has any life within it. For this process of differentiation is, qua difference, all the content. This process, however, which places itself outside of that unity, is an alternation which does not return into itself, of being for another and of being for self. It is reality in the way that this is an object for the actual consciousness of pure insight, utility. Paragraph 579 is a short paragraph, and there's a good bit going on there, some of which is playing off of the important transition that took place in the previous paragraphs, not least thinking about thinghood and thought and pure being and the negative, but leading us towards an important crux where we're going to reintroduce a concept that we had brought up before in this area, in this portion of the text, that of utility. That's what this paragraph ends with. And utility really is going to be, to use the title of this entire section, the truth of the Enlightenment. We're going to see that carry forward into the next section, but we'll talk about that more later. Let's focus here on what's actually going on in the text in this little portion. So Hegel says, essence is split into two in such a way that two different ways of considering it are involved. This is not something new. This has been what was sketched out in the previous paragraphs. So he talks about the negative as one of those and pure being. And this is, in fact, something that's at the core of Hegelian metaphysics. You see this starting point in the science of logic, the consideration of being and nothingness, right? Or the negative. And so this is key to what a thing is for Hegel. He's not really going to dwell on that all that much. And here it's associated with particular contents, you could say. So he says, essence must consider difference within itself. Now, the difference is between these two things. It's not as if considering difference is one of the sides and not considering difference is the other side. There's already difference within both sides, and there's difference between both sides. So he says, because of this, the two ways of considering it merge into one. The abstract moments of pure being and the negative, or in the previous paragraph, thinghood, the in itself, and thought, consciousness, right, of things, are united in the object so considered. So these are both aspects of what is being considered. What is that thing that's being considered? Ultimately, it's going to be utility, but he hasn't told us that yet. So we have to wait until the end before we're actually going to see that. So Hegel talks here then about there being a universal common to both. And it's the abstraction of a pure inward oscillation. What's an oscillation? It means going back and forth between these two. So there's a kind of dynamic movement there, but it's not a movement that is, progressing towards something. oscillation, think about a pendulum as it goes back and forth. It swings. That's what he's got in mind there. And this pure oscillation is, as he says, of pure self-thinking. That's worth pausing on for just a moment. Why? Well, whenever we're dealing with something that, until we get to the very end, that's self-thinking, where the self has become, you might say, detached from everything else out there, and it's just considering its own contents, there's more to be developed. The self-thinking itself is never really going to be the end of the story. So that tells us that we're at a point where something new has to come on the scene. Now, he calls this a simple rotatory motion, right? Again, oscillation. It's going around and around. Must become more complex. Okay. Why does it have to become more complex? Well, to begin with, it's not adequate to the reality that it's been trying to grasp. I mean, is this the end point for the Hegelian dialectic? This can't be it, right? So we can go on from here. Hegel says, why does it have to be more complex? It is itself only motion by distinguishing its moments. And we see this in Hegel over and over again as a theme. The self-identical must repel itself from itself. And that is, in part, what goes on with negation, right? And negation, here's another thing we can say that's not being said explicitly in the text. You never have pure being by itself. There's always the negative haunting it. And that has to be the case if that pure being is actually going to be thought. Because thinking itself goes beyond the thing thought. It's not simply absorbed in it. It's different from it. So, he goes on and he says, this distinguishing of the moments leaves their unmoved unity behind as the empty husk of pure being, which is no longer actual thought, no longer has life within it. This process of differentiation is, qua difference, all the content. So we're no longer just focusing on the essence as such. We're focusing on what the essence is unfolding itself into, what it's revealing as going on within it. So here Hegel's going to make an important transition that's going to lead us into the end of this section now. He says the process which places itself outside of that unity, the process, is an alternation which does not return into itself. What is this alternation? It's an alternation of being for another and being for self. So he says, it is reality in the way this is an object for the actual consciousness of pure insight. This is what pure insight has been realizing, the real, the essential, that which is the most important, including its own self, to be utility. General, abstract utility. Utility involves being for self, being conscious of one's own self, right? Having that reflexive relation to self. But it also involves being for another, an instrumentality, a value insofar as one leads to, one conduces to, one brings about something that matters for another. I am useful, for example, to you in, hopefully, understanding this dense Hegelian text. I have a certain utility. Hegel's text has a certain utility for us in hopefully expanding our minds to understand the dialectical process of history, development of consciousness. All of that can be understood in its being for another. And Hegel says there's an oscillation, being for self, being for an other, that is at the core of consciousness in the insight of pure enlightenment. Bad as utility may look to faith or sentimentality, or even to the abstract thought that calls itself speculation, which clings to the in itself, Yet, it is in utility that pure insight achieves its realization and has itself for its object, an object which it now no longer repudiates, and which too no longer has for it the value of the void or the pure beyond. For pure insight is, as we saw, the existent notion itself, or pure self-identical personality, distinguishing itself within itself in such a way that each of the distinguished moments is itself pure notion. That is at the same time not distinguished. Pure insight is simple, pure self-consciousness, which is for itself as well as in itself in an immediate unity. Its being in itself is therefore not an enduring being, but in its difference immediately ceases to be something. Such a being, however, that is immediately without support is not an intrinsic being, but is essentially for an other, which is the power that absorbs it. But this second moment, which is opposed to the first, or the being in itself, equally vanishes immediately like the first. Or as a being which is only for an other, it is rather the vanishing itself, and there is posited the accomplished return into itself, being for self. This simple being for self, however, as self-identity, is rather a mere being, or is thereby for another. This nature of pure insight in the unfolding of its moments, or insight qua object, is expressed in the useful. What is useful or is something with an enduring being in itself, or a thing. This being in itself is at the same time only a pure moment. Hence it is absolutely for an other, but equally is for an other merely what it is in itself. These opposed moments have returned into the indivisible unity of being for self. While the useful does express the notion of pure insight, it is not pure insight as such, but insight conceived by it in the form of object. It is merely the restless alternation of those moments of which one indeed is itself the accomplished return into itself, but only as a being for self. That is, as an abstract moment appearing on one side over against the others. The useful itself is not a negative essence, having in itself these moments in their antithesis and at the same time as undivided into one and the same respect or as thought, as they are qua pure insight. The moment of being for self is certainly present in the useful, but not in such a way that it overarches the other moments, the in itself and the being for another, in which case it would be the self. Pure insight has therefore in the useful its own notion in its pure moments for object. It is the awareness of this metaphysics, but not as yet the comprehension of it. Consciousness has not yet reached the unity of being and notion itself. Since the useful still has the form of an object for pure insight, it does have a world, one which it is true is no longer in and for itself, but yet a world which it distinguishes from itself. Only, since the antitheses have emerged at the summit of the notion, the next stage will see them come into collision, and the Enlightenment will taste the fruits of its deeds. Paragraph 580 is quite long, and there's a lot going on in this penultimate portion of this short section, The Truth of Enlightenment. Here, we are finding out what the truth of enlightenment actually is in terms of the useful or utility as what pure insight grasps itself as and how it grasps itself in relation to the world. The next paragraph is going to finish by talking a lot more about that world, so we'll go into that just a little bit here. Hegel begins this paragraph by saying, utility seems bad to faith or sentimentality. Notice that there's a difference here between faith and sentimentality. Faith, you remember, was the mode of pure thinking. It is not just a feeling, some sort of vague sentiment or something like that. Instead, faith is an attempt to think out thought through content. And pure insight was critical of faith, and we had this entire movement of the Enlightenment. Sentimentality is something that pops up over and over and over again. And for Hegel, it's always going to be something rather debased, right? So utility looks bad for sentimentality. Who cares what sentimentality thinks? It looks bad for faith, though, because it turns everything into the useful. It takes away the absolute value of its content. And then Hegel says it also looks bad for something else. Abstract thought that calls itself speculation. Now, isn't that interesting? We can distinguish between the practical and the theoretical, right? And we usually in philosophy give a higher priority to the theoretical, or if you want to call it the contemplative, or the speculative, or pure reason, right? Practical, well, that's in the realm of ethics and, personal choice and maybe politics and aesthetics too, insofar as it's a value field and we can have anything interesting to say. And there's usually this imbalance, right? Let's get the metaphysics and the epistemology and the logic down right, and then we'll get to the ethics. Hegel never adopts that as a finished perspective. It's not an effective organizational principle. There's always a back and forth going on between the practical and the speculative within Hegel. The speculative can only truly be speculative insofar as it turns into something. So in a way, the Enlightenment and pure insight is leading the theoretical and leading faith along in its wake, like it or not, in terms of the useful, in terms of utility. All right, so that's the first sentence, right? He says, it is in utility that pure insight achieves its realization and has itself for an object. Utility is the way in which pure insight is able to grasp itself. Now, what is pure insight? Is pure insight some kind of, thing floating around out there that just happens to take possession of us every once in a while, like a spirit of the age? No, pure insight consists in what it is that we human beings are doing insofar as we are self-consciously, rationally working from the perspective of pure insight and not, say, faith, sentimentality, abstract thought, or something along those lines. So it's a way in which we can make sense of ourselves. I am a useful thing. I'm also a person, right? It allows us to conceptualize ourselves. So he goes on and he says, it has itself for an object which it now no longer repudiates, and which too no longer has for it the value of the void or the pure beyond. The void or the pure beyond was coming up as absolute being, right? Now we're centered on persons and our relations to each other, and fitting into a common social matrix. So he goes on and he says, pure insight is the existent notion itself, or pure, here's a wonderful phrase, pure self-identical personality, distinguishing itself within itself in such a way that each of the distinguished moments is itself pure notion. We saw that discussed earlier. Is at the same time not distinguished. Pure insight is simple, pure self-consciousness. Now here he starts getting into these distinctions, right? Which is for itself as well as in itself in immediate unity. Now why did I put being for another and being for self? Because in the previous paragraph, these were coming together as utility. So now the pure insight conceptualizing itself is doing so insofar as it grasps itself both being for another and being for self. But now, what is the status of the being in itself? What is it? What is pure insight? This is the section, truth of the Enlightenment, right? So he says, its being in itself is not an enduring being. Its being in itself is not an enduring being. In its difference, it ceases to be something. So he says, such a being that is immediately without support is not an intrinsic being, but is essentially for another. So the in itself of the person reveals itself as being for another. Should this be a big surprise to us? What is the essence of self-consciousness? It is to exist in relation to others. Can you have being in itself, yourself, all by yourself, before you come to anybody else? Are you even an individual in that respect? No. You're an individual insofar as you exist in relation to others. So Hegel goes on and he says, this second moment, which is opposed to the first, to the being in itself, equally vanishes immediately like the first, or as a being that is only for another. Now notice the difference there. There's a vast gulf between existing for another and only existing for another. What is the difference? You can exist for another and also exist in yourself and also exist for yourself. The key is to how to integrate these with each other, right? Existing only for another means that you only really have being, value, essence, insofar as another decides what you are. You become then something like, the slave and the master-slave dialectic at the early point, the unessential consciousness. So he goes on and he says, essentially, being essentially for another means being for the power that absorbs it. And he says, this second moment, which is opposed to the first, vanishes. A being which is only for another is the vanishing itself. There is posited the accomplished return into itself. Now here's where Hegel is doing his usual sort of, first we have alienation and, things separating out from each other, and then we have a reintegration, right? And I wouldn't worry so much about what the internal logic is for this, because he doesn't supply it, right? He says, the simple being for self, as self-identity, is a mere being or is for another. So there's this dialectic going on here between being for self and being for another. What's the upshot of this? What's the payoff? He says, this nature of pure insight is the unfolding of its moments, this unfolding that we've just done here, and it's expressed in the useful. So now he's going to give us an analysis of the useful, of ourselves as useful things. Useful for what, we could ask, right? And he's going to answer that. So he says, what is useful is something with an enduring being in itself, right? It is a thing. This being in itself, he says, is at the same time only a pure moment. Hence, it is absolutely for another. So these are two aspects, right? We've transposed this now down to here. The useful, in order to be useful, has to actually exist. At the same time, in order to be useful, it has to be useful in relation to something else. So its being is in a certain sense dependent, right? And he says, here we go. It's equally for another merely what it is in itself. These opposed moments have returned into the indivisible unity of being for self. Being for self involves being for another and having intrinsic being, as he's saying. Now here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. He says, the useful does express the notion of pure insight, the concept, the way in which it's understanding itself in relation to everything else. But it's not pure insight as such, but insight conceived by it in the form of object. So we haven't completely gotten to the total truth of insight, what it is. Insight is not completely insightful about itself, you might say. So he says, we have this alternation of these moments. One indeed is for itself the accomplished return into itself, but only as being for self. Only as being for itself, not as being in and for itself. Right? So he says the useful is not a negative essence, having in itself these moments in their antithesis or opposition, and at the same time is undivided in one and the same object. The useful is not a completely developed concept, you might say. So he says, here we go. The moment of being for self is present in the useful, but not in such a way that it overarches the other moments. So you've got this back and forth. Everything is involved with everything else. We have the in itself, the being for another, being for itself, all present at the same time. And he says, pure insight has in the useful its own notion in its pure moments for object, not as subject yet, not yet grasping itself totally for itself and in itself at the same time. Now here's where Hegel says something quite interesting. It makes a transition that is going to be important, something we'll dwell upon in the last paragraph. He brings up the notion of world. So he says, it's the awareness of this metaphysics, not yet comprehension of it. Awareness is one thing. Comprehension means totally understanding it. And comprehending it would be to have the fully developed notion, the Begriff, right? Doesn't have that. So he says the useful still has the form of an object, and it does have a world. One which is no longer in and for itself, but a world which it, insight, distinguishes from itself. It distinguishes the world from itself while at the same time being in the world and using the useful as the key, the way to the lens, if you like, the perspective by which to make sense of the world as a totality of things and of itself and its own place in that world. So he says, since the antitheses have emerged at the summit of the notion, the concept, the next stage is going to see them come into collision, and enlightenment will taste the fruits of its deeds. Now, how's it going to taste those fruits? Well, notice what the next section is called. Absolute freedom. Hey, that sounds like a good thing, right? And terror. Maybe not so good, right? So now, we just have to get through the next paragraph and see what Hegel's going to do with this concept of world and do a bit of retrospective of how far we've come before we're ready to jump into the next section.